welcome back. This is the final session of ATEPS 2021. Thank you for staying with us these last 2 days. So prior to the Delta outbreak and the lockdowns that followed, this conference was scheduled for September 2021, with panels dedicated to engaging with the topic of Apec and what New Zealand's hosting of the year would deliver. Now we begin this panel a month after Leaders Week, meaning that we can take stock of Apec 2021 and explore in more depth what was achieved during New Zealand's year of hosting. We begin this panel with someone who needs no introduction. He's been labelled the quiet figure behind New Zealand's Apec success and New Zealand's top trade diplomat who was slogging away behind the scenes to make our hosting of Apec a success. Vangali is MFAT's Deputy Secretary, Trade and Economic. He was Apec 2021 Senior Officials Meeting Chair. He's been an important person behind the creation of ATEPS, and he's an alumni of the University of Auckland. Welcome, Vangali.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that very generous introduction. I do want to, immediately put on the record that in fact, all of the people on the panel that will follow me are actually the ones that really helped drive our success this year. So while it's always wonderful to be the SOM chair, you're only as good as your team, and I had a really excellent team. What I thought I'd do is, in the sort of the 10 minutes that I've got, I'd sketch briefly the context in which we took on our hosting responsibilities this year, and then talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that we achieved. And then in particular, I want to emphasize the importance and I think the significance of the Aotearoa Plan of Action in terms of the way ahead for Apec as an institution. And for me, as someone who's been involved in Apec for a long time, perhaps almost as long as some of the other people on this panel, Apec is what I consider to be one of those regional public goods that provides the ecosystem from which we derive, guidelines, standards that eventually become parts of the hard rules and the architecture across our region. It is an incredibly important enabling institution and an incubator of good ideas. And I think this year we demonstrated as hosts and as chair how effective this body can be, even in a time of what was a considerable human and economic crisis. So let me start with that contextual point. On the day we took over the responsibility of host and chairing of Apec, right through until now, in fact, 100,000 people get infected by COVID a year across our region. 80 million jobs have been lost, and 1 million people in our region alone have died as a consequence of COVID. So the human catastrophe that COVID has wrought across our region really can't be underestimated, and of course was a fundamental part of the way in which we had to think about our hosting responsibilities. And throughout the year, of course, it was striking how many of our colleagues were having to do meetings from home. And of course, near the end of our hosting year, many of us also, because we went into lockdown as well, were needing to go into to managing these processes in a way that while we had really planned for, we had hoped we would not need to be doing. I think also the second, so that the human toll and the sort of your colleagues, very real challenges that they faced in their own economies was brought home, I think, very clearly to us across the digital platforms we were using. The economic toll too was certainly starting to be felt across the region as we progressed through our host year. There'd been a lot of wild talk about, the complete collapse of goods trade and services trade and so on. Fortunately, none of that held up, but there is no question we've seen the most significant contraction, certainly in trade flows, that we've seen in the last 30 years and possibly further back than that. And across our region, of course, the services trade, particularly tourism and education services, has of course essentially almost vanished. While there are good signs of revival, it does all paint a picture of a very challenging context in which Apec was meant to function. And just want to flag too that in the year that we picked it up, it came through 3 challenging years before that. In Papua New Guinea, through no fault of Papua New Guinea as host, we were not able collectively, the 21 of us, to agree a consensus leaders statement. The following year, Chile, for its own domestic reasons, had to cancel the Leaders Week. And Malaysia, partway through its own year, was forced to go to a fully digital platform. But I do want to acknowledge that we do owe Malaysia an enormous debt of gratitude for the way in which they were able to shepherd the Putrajaya vision. And the Putrajaya vision, of course, is the foundation document for the Aotearoa Plan of Action, on which I want to devote a couple of moments to. But this was the kind of the challenging situation we were in. It was also a year in which we would have COP26, also the year in which there would be the UN World Food Summit, and of course the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference, the 12th Ministerial Conference, of course, most recently cancelled. And of course, part of the context for the year, of course, was G20 and G7 meetings that, of course, happen every year. And then alongside all of that, we had considerable uncertainty across the region, both in terms of the health impacts, but also how deep and lasting would the economic impacts be, and how should we be thinking about those? So a lot of uncertainty that we needed to grapple with in that year. And unfortunately too, it must be said, lots of evidence, I'm afraid, of protectionism, and particularly invidious types of protectionism, sort of the creeping protectionism, people installing particular barriers and restrictions and justifying them on the basis of COVID, and then not taking them away as the situation eases. So some really big challenges that we faced across our region there, all of which framed the way in which we thought about a year in 2 ways. One, we wanted to, show that this institution could respond to a crisis, could respond to the pandemic, and do it in the way in which it played to APEC's strengths. And second, we wanted APEC to position our region for the recovery to come. So in practical terms, what did we do? Well, as I said, we looked to play to the strengths of APEC, but I think what we also looked to do was we looked to really push in some ambition and some genuinely sort of New Zealand flavored elements that we look to drive into the APEC agenda. And it's easy to forget sometimes that a lot of the things that were secured this year were certainly not a feature of APEC's work program in previous years. But look, let me start with the very practical things we look to do. With the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, well and truly underway as we took up our host year, we've done quite a bit of research on how trade measures were affecting the crisis. And of course, we established that many tariffs were in place across the region, 6% on vaccines, 9% on syringes. People were deliberately raising the cost for their own citizens of this kind of equipment. And the PPE equipment, for example, between 9 and 12%, depending on the economy. In other words, 9 to 12% more expensive than it needed to be. So one of the big things that we pushed this year, and Minister O'Connor drove very hard in his bilateral meetings with his counterparts, was to eliminate those tariffs. And I'm really pleased that 17 of the 21 APEC economies were able to report that they reduced or eliminated tariffs on both vaccines, protective equipment, medical products that you need to combat COVID. The other thing that we were very focused on, again, playing to the strengths of APEC, was to drive best practice guidelines for customs procedures. And this was driven out of the knowledge that, with thanks to our colleagues from the Customs Agency in New Zealand and their minister, very focused on the establishment of guidelines that would facilitate and accelerate these PPE equipment and medical products that you needed to fight COVID more quickly through the region. We discovered, for example, that in some parts of our APEC family, there were members that it could take up to over a month, sometimes weeks, and in many cases days. And so what we did was we instituted these best practice guidelines. 16 APEC economies introduced them, and all of them have implemented sort of what I like to call as fast lanes. For this kind of equipment that comes through the border, it goes through now within hours and maximum within days. So a very significant effort to try to make sure that we had the enabling environment so that people could use the equipment to fight COVID, the testing kits, the vaccines, and so on, that we're able to move across the border. Building on the work that had been done by Malaysia in the previous year on, the goods, the products that we need to fight COVID, we also identified services, so logistical services. It's not just about the products moving across the border, you also need to distribute them across your economy. And that requires, transport, logistics services. And that was again in recognition by ministers that we needed to really sharpen up and improve the way in which those services could help us distribute the products that would become so vital to saving lives across the region. And then I think very significantly, and I think given the situation at the moment, the 21 APEC economies were able to join a consensus in support of a TRIPS waiver for vaccines. And that, I think, is a very significant outcome given who is in APEC, United States, China, Russia, major producers of the vaccines, and the commitment by them to support that TRIPS waiver, and the fact that they were all 21 of them going to carry that into the World Trade Organization negotiations, I think was a real tribute to, particularly to Minister O'Connor, who drove that very hard and reminded G20 trade ministers that this was APEC in action. The 21 of them, more than half of global trade, saying, yes, we support a TRIPS waiver, and his encouragement to other economies that this was something that they needed to deal with. Also worth remembering, that I think one of the things we've forgotten is that a number of our economies were imposing export restrictions on one another, preventing PPE equipment, vaccines, syringes, and the equipment that you need to distribute the vaccine effectively across economies. Those export restrictions are kind of, in trade we say beggar your neighbor policies, but in this case, sicken your neighbor policies. And again, a real source of pride for Minister O'Connor when he spoke to the G20 trade ministers, when he said, since May, when trade ministers met and agreed this statement, no APEC economy has introduced an export restriction since then. I'm pleased to say that continues to be the case even as our year comes to an end. Then there are the interesting things that we were able to achieve. This is the point about the incubator of good ideas. APEC is still the only intergovernmental organization that has a list of agreed environmental goods. That was updated in our year in a technical sense, but also we are now very proudly the only intergovernmental organization that has a list of agreed environmental services. So, more than 20 years ago, the WTO said we should identify what are environmental goods and services. We still have no agreement there, and APEC remains the only institution that has an agreed list, and some very interesting services identified there. For example, carbon capture services. So some new environmental services that APEC has identified to take into wider processes. Then there are a number of elements that we picked up from previous colleagues. So Chile had been a big driver of the La Serena roadmap, women's economic empowerment. That was a big push of ours, making the point that there's not just a moral case here, but an economic case that we are really leaving literally billions of dollars on the table by our failure collectively across the region to deal with big issues like pay equity and women's representation in exporting and so on. And I'm afraid the New Zealand data on women in exporting is something that we clearly do need to work on as well. So again, one of those big pushes by New Zealand to drive that part of the agenda. It's also worth remembering, and often a surprise to a New Zealand audience, that Indigenous issues are not discussed in APEC and have not been a subject for a meaningful dialogue. That all changed as a consequence of New Zealand hosting this year. And I want to acknowledge in particular Taria, who's online here, for the work that she led in bringing that particular very significant issue. And it's very difficult to understand why this was proved to be so challenging for us. And let me be open about the fact it was very challenging indeed to advance Indigenous issues this year. The Indigenous inclusion, as I said, hard to understand. 271 million people across our region are from Indigenous communities. The case that we were able to provide about the dynamism and the productivity benefits of the Maori economy, I think were a big driver, but also I think critically, the presence of Minister Mahuta in some of the key policy dialogues, I think helped drive a sense amongst the wider membership that we were serious. This did need to be an agenda item, not just in our host year, but going forward as well. And then look, it's sort of two last observations, one on climate change. Our region is responsible for nearly 60% of global emissions. We have a responsibility, and we were very clear, and our Prime Minister was very determined, extremely determined. I can tell you as SOM chair, there were some tough moments on this one. She was very determined that APEC needed to do something about fossil fuel subsidies. And, the acknowledgement that we were 60% of global emissions, and that, for nearly 15 years, APEC and G7 and G20 economies had been saying we must reform fossil fuel subsidies, but no one has actually done anything about it. This year, that fundamentally changed. And it changed in a classic APEC way. Very practical mechanism set up. It's called a standstill on fossil fuel subsidization. And in the CTI report, Annex 15, lists the way in which APEC economies will now deal with this. A template approach, peer reviews, but also fundamentally from the end of next year, a standstill on this by APEC members. So very significant achievement and driven very much from our Prime Minister. And indeed, that was a crucial part of our ability to advance that. As a final comment, perhaps arguably our greatest legacy, I think, to APEC is going to be the Aotearoa Plan of Action, the APA. This is effectively the 20-year plan for the 21 of us. It includes the classical trade and economic agenda that you'd expect APEC to have: take away barriers to trade and services, goods, investment, intellectual property right protection, and so on. But it also includes some very important additions: sustainability and inclusion, including, by the way, not just women's economic empowerment, not just SMEs, which in a sense have been a fundamental part of the APEC agenda, but critically to Indigenous populations as well. So a very important addition there. And the sustainability and inclusion, of course, includes that climate change work. And it's very easy to forget that for the last 10 years, we've barely talked about climate change in APEC. We are certainly going to be talking about it over the coming years. Then there's an important digital and innovation set of work, a very important agenda there that I think is going to be both challenging, but also an area that APEC really needs to help all of us as we look to advance. This goes back to my point about the ecosystem that APEC can provide, and the way in which we build consensus among us to try to drive new digital guidelines and indeed take those up into the harder rules that we look to pick up over time. This, of course, will be a living document. It has reviews every 5 years. It has measurable, clear objectives and targets under each of the headings there. Again, a really strong New Zealand practical focus brought to that piece of work. So let me close there by saying a very challenging year, very clear in our own minds that we needed to situate this institution of ours that we all cared about, and I do mean the 21, not just New Zealand, but that we all cared about, that we wanted it to respond to the pandemic in practical ways. This was not the time for warm words and rhetoric. This was actually the time for real action. And I'm really pleased with the work that the 21 of us were collectively able to do to respond to that crisis, but also to reset and kind of think about where we wanted to be in terms of the recovery itself, and making sure that we mainstreamed. And it's unbelievable that in this day and age, we had to talk about mainstreaming, women's economic empowerment, Indigenous inclusion, and of course, climate change. And I think New Zealanders can be very proud indeed of what it is that that was achieved in this year because of that agenda set by a very determined set of ministers and Prime Minister that wanted this achieved. And in terms of that legacy, of course, the Aotearoa Plan of Action, a critical piece that I think we look on now with considerable pride. But I think as the years progress and the very challenging geopolitical environment we're in, that Aotearoa Plan of Action, I think, is a very, very important anchor for our region to bring it together in a way that is going to be very important, particularly for the small economies of APEC like our own. My thanks again. It's been a real privilege to host and chair the senior officials meetings process from a personal level. I've made no secret of the fact that it's a career highlight for me, but I do think our team, who really have performed, if I may say so, superlatively to deliver for New Zealand and New Zealanders in this context. So thank you very much, Jennifer. And
Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you, Vangeli. We very much appreciate your sharing your insights. And we look forward to you participating in the Q&A session after our next panel. So I'm going to hand over to Fran O'Sullivan now, who also needs no introduction. So Fran, I'm not going to use your time to do that. And over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, Jennifer, it's been a fantastic year, APEC, and started the planning, obviously started some 4 years ago. And having been a person who was involved with the APEC CEO Summit Board in 1999, when we hosted in person, I started on that journey as part of Barbara Chapman's group this time round, thinking we would be doing the same. So it's been quite a revolution in digital diplomacy, bringing it all off virtually. And quite a tribute, really, I think, to the kind of Kiwi determination that we sometimes see when confronted with a fairly large challenge. And, you know, within this forum, I'd like to especially give a bit of a personal tribute of somebody who's been involved and also written about this and seen the magnitude of what everyone's been coping with, to Vangeli and his team, but also specifically to Mark as the senior APEC official and the person who has been guiding the development of policy during this time. And also Taria Tahana dealing again with bringing forward the Maori, not just the Maori policy perspective, but also developing an Indigenous framework across APEC, which is quite an innovation, really. So we've seen two threads of work coming through there, you know, basically doing the whole deal virtually and navigating that, but also making policy inroads and bringing together the Aotearoa plan, no small task in a year when everyone's been diverted by COVID, and also introducing new innovative elements to APEC. And then, of course, we have Rob Scollay, who is, I guess, New Zealand's leading academic when it comes to things APEC. Became director of the APEC Study Centre back in 1995, which was just 2 years after New Zealand went to the first meeting of APEC leaders hosted by Bill Clinton up in Seattle. So very much early in on the ground and has led a lot of the development of the issues that New Zealand ought to be thinking about when it comes to APEC, the regional architecture, the big gavotte that has gone on for a very long time now on issues like FTAP and others. And so that's a very brief roundup introduction of everybody. I don't want to spend too much more time on this because, you know, we have the addresses and then we have the Q&A and the interest of the audience as well. So perhaps if I pass to you first, Mark, to make a start with your presentation, and then we'll take all the questions in one round at the end.
Sure thing. Thanks, Fran, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the panel. It's you know, quite a panel of luminaries, frankly. Starting with you, Fran, given, you know, your extensive sort of exposure to APEC, but Rob as well as somebody who's built his career in this domain. So it's quite kind of, you know, fear-inducing. It's almost like appearing before the headmaster and waiting to get the report card. Look, Fran, I'm probably going to give you some minutes back because Vangelis and I are like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. You know, what he said, I absolutely agree with because those are our shared talking points. But I thought I would very quickly just sort of zoom out, and I was sort of reflecting on the fact that this is the Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School, and I went to school and did my sort of international relations and international economics stuff, and I was sort of thinking about what we achieved this year in that context. And you know, Fran, when we started this year, we lived in a realist world. This region is a realist region right now. You know, we really have some massive geostrategic rivalry going on in our region right now that we are all trying to navigate in our different ways. And that's a significant change certainly since the last time we hosted in 1999, but I would contend a change that has sort of been fermenting over the last few years. So I was thinking about our APEC host year and why it mattered in this context. And I would like to put it to you that there are a couple of reasons why it mattered. First of all, institutions like APEC are places where we can come as a regional community to be reminded that actually a lot of the problems that we are dealing with are transboundary problems. We are all navigating them. Let's take the virus. As Vangelis said earlier, 100,000 new cases every day. He said every year, 100,000 cases every single day in the APEC region of COVID-19. a global economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen since World War II, with the lowest interest rates since 1750, would you believe, Alan Bollard says, and massive growth in debt in our region. And a climate crisis, the parameters of which Vangelis has traversed, but one of my favourite sort of illustrative statistics is that 19 of the hottest years on record have occurred over the last 21 years in the world. You know, this is things are heating up, and we need to deal with it. These are not issues that we can deal with alone as economies or nations. These are issues that require international cooperation. And when we sit in a part of the world where international cooperation has frayed over recent years, partly as a result of that geostrategic competition, we need institutions like APEC to be working more than ever before. Now, what is it that APEC does? Well, Vangelis has just outlined for you some really wonderful things that we delivered in our year. And I'd suggest to you that he is a much more practical guy than I am. I sort of think in much more sort of esoteric terms. And I would highlight sort of three aspects of APEC that I think are really, really important in an intergenerational sense. First of all, people joke that APEC is a perfect excuse for a conversation. It is, frankly. This is an institution that does not create rules. It's informal in nature. It's consensus-based. So this is an institution where people come together and build a common understanding of some of our shared problems, a shared sense of some of the solutions that we might adopt to those problems, and sort of building a bit of an understanding around our shared sort of destiny. And I would say it's not just government. It's absolutely a critical part of the way in which APEC works, that we also bring together very, very deliberately business and ensure that business is part of our APEC infrastructure throughout the year, in APEC Business Advisory Council supporting us, but also at the end of the year, as Fran's referred to, the CEO Summit, which is this wonderful opportunity to bring together business leaders from across our region to begin to get a bit of a shared understanding of some of the big issues they're facing and some of the ways, frankly, that we might navigate out of them. Youth are a hardwired part of the APEC ecosystem with the voices of the future. This is a really important opportunity to bring through the next generation, to hear from the next generation about the issues that they are worried about, that they are going to inherit, and to support them in building their capability sets in order to engage internationally. And I'd also say Indigenous peoples, and I'd pay particular tribute to Taria here. Taria has worked tirelessly this year to find different ways to bring Indigenous peoples together, to hear a unique perspective on some of those transboundary issues we're facing and how Indigenous peoples can navigate them. So what does it actually deliver for us? Well, I would suggest that APEC delivers for New Zealand a couple of things. First of all, building the support for some of the ideas and the values that we believe in. This is really serious stuff. It sounds kind of a bit woolly and what have you, but we all know that the ferment that goes on in your mind, that sort of mental mind map that you create for yourself, influences the policy choices, the business decisions that you take. So using APEC to build this idea that Vangelis has talked a little bit about, that rules really matter to the international trading community, that markets and that economic solutions really matter in a region where states are increasingly coming to the fore, that actually our future growth can be sustainable, that it can be inclusive, that these ideas really, really matter. And the reason why they matter is because they change the way in which economies in our region take decisions about what they're doing. And I'd pay tribute to Vangelis for ensuring for the first time that sustainability is meaningfully on the APEC agenda after at least a decade of absence here. The second thing I wanted to say about why APEC matters to New Zealand is it absolutely supports our interests as well as our values and our ideas. And here I'd use just two very quick examples. One is the way in which APEC has supported the liberalisation of trade and investment flows in our region. average tariffs have fallen from 16% to 4.7% since APEC's formation. New Zealand has FTAs with almost every single APEC economy, with the exception of the United States and Russia. If you look at our FTA architecture, we do not have an FTA entered into force with any economy outside of the APEC region. And it also matters in terms of our economic prosperity. This is a region where GDP per capita has doubled since 1989. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. And that's happened because APEC economies have made the right policy choices and the right policy decisions. And part of that has been influenced by that ferment that I talked about. So Fran, I'll leave it there, but this is an institution that matters to us, not just in 2021, but going forward as well.
Thank you, Mark, and we'll come back to some of that broader ambition around APEC and those advancing of New Zealand's strategic interests when we get to the Q&A. Perhaps, Tari, if we come to you next to give us some insights into what has been achieved from your perspective through APEC.
Tēnā tātou, kia koe I te rangatira Fran, rawa ko Jennifer, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Ko wai ahau, ko matawhara te maunga, roto I te roto, nā te piki ao te iwi. Nā ku te honore ki te taimai tēnei ahi ki te kōrero kia koutou e pāna ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirihira. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So thank you for having me at this third ATEPS session. It's a real privilege to be here alongside my colleagues, the leadership of Vangelis and Mark, who have really enabled us to do some things that we're really proud of this year. For me, I wanted to talk about three things. Mark has drummed into us, stick to three. So, you know, the first was, what was our vision and what did we set out to do? And clearly, you know, Vangelis and Mark have both sort of outlined at a high level, but what did that look like? We've talked a little bit about why it matters, but sort of wanted to just talk specifically about that in our Indigenous context. And then what did we achieve and where to from here? So, you know, I just want to start by saying this has been a long journey, and Fran, you talked about sort of 4 years in the build-up. In 2019, I went to Chile and did the first corridor around Indigenous, and that was really setting the scene. And Vangelis talked about, you know, the dynamism and I suppose the might that we've got in the Māori economy, you know, and I did really see how much it resonated. Our APEC ko-mātua, as I call him, Rory, warned me when I first joined, you know, that it was fine to have high ambition, but APEC was like water dripping on stone, and that things would happen slowly over time. And I think we've all actually been surprised at how much we were able to achieve this year. So we set out with a vision, and our vision was about not only us as Māori, but it was about embedding Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into the trade and economic settings of the Asia Pacific region. And within that, we had three pillars. The first was within the policy agenda, how could we advance Indigenous economic inclusion? The second was, how could we utilise our hosting of APEC to create more Indigenous connections? And this is where Māori said to us, my goodness, what you're doing in APEC, you know, that's, you know, for us looking in the rear vision mirror, where, you know, we want you to be more ambitious with what you can achieve. And so that was really about how do we get rangatahi exposed to APEC? How did we build the connections? How did we, as we had to pivot to this digital world, how did we ensure that Māori got to benefit from some of that digital diplomacy that we were all a part of? So that Indigenous connections was really important. And then thirdly, obviously the treaty, and how did we do this in partnership with Māori? And how did New Zealand model partnership in its interactions with other economies. So those were the three things that we set out to do and focused on this year. Moving now to the point of why it matters. And, you know, when I first started in this role, I was actually quite astounded when we went to look for the statistics on, well, how many Indigenous people are there in this region? It was quite a task to even be able to find some statistics. Some economies clearly debated those statistics. We found some data in the OECD that indicated there is approximately 476 million in the world and about 217 million within this region. You know, so a pretty significant population that we do want to be part of these economic discussions. I had previously been to the UN, to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and as a New Zealand government, we did a little side event on the Māori economy and the potential there. And I could see that it wasn't really the forum for these economic issues to be discussed in the way that we wanted them to, you know, be addressed and the conversations we wanted to be a part of. You know, so this year we have clearly made Indigenous a part of that discussion and shown people that the interests that we have and things like collective ownership and how we navigate that, the fact that, you know, we've got capital constraints, that the capacity and the capability of our people is a challenge to build that in terms of our economies. So there was a lot of issues that we were able to deal with that really did have an economic, you know, an economic focus that I would say in the past, in this regional architecture, didn't have a home. So we created a home in APEC for Indigenous peoples and their economic issues. I think the other thing, obviously, is there's always a challenge with us having inequities that we're already starting from a different place as others. Look, I think time is moving on, so let's just move on to showing the video. I think we've got a video. It's a quick montage of what we felt we achieved, and then I can wrap up with where to from here.
I believe that we have a prime opportunity to call on the bicultural values that have characterised who we are and as a people.
In 2021, we have had the privilege of hosting the most important event New Zealand will host in a generation. One that brings in 21 economies all joined together by the Pacific Ocean, 38% of the world's population, 48% of the world's trade, thousands of delegates, hundreds of meetings. Our bicultural values and Indigenous perspectives have featured prominently in APEC for the first time, which will contribute to increased economic participation of 270 million Indigenous peoples in the region.
So there were an extraordinary number of highlights for me today in what was ABEC's first ever Indigenous Business Leaders Dialogue. I can't go past having Minister Mahuta and US Secretary Deb Haaland. They were a real highlight for me today, shining light on what it was to lead from the front as Indigenous leaders.
One of the things I've learned is that it's important for us to all work together. As an Indigenous business owner, but also serving on government, the ability for Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments to come together to think about the benefit of the future of the country moving forward together is important.
We have worked to raise the profile of the value of the Indigenous economy and its role as a driver both of sustainability but also of our collective recovery.
El tapo, que quiere decir restricción, y humana, apoyar al otro sin esperar algo a cambio.
We have strengthened Indigenous connections, bringing together our Indigenous brothers and sisters from across Asia Pacific. And we have done this all in partnership with Māori, Te Rangi Tūkupu, a collective of 8 entities who alongside government have contributed to making APEC 2021 a year like no other, ensuring Māori make a meaningful, authentic and impactful contribution to digital diplomacy and our virtual hosting of APEC.
So having hosted APEC and being a central part to it we're just really grateful that we've been able to uphold the tenets of our tupuna through Te Rangi Tūkupu, and as a collective of people, Māori people from throughout the country, e mihi tonu ana kia koutou katoa.
APEC has given us an opportunity as Māori and as Indigenous and First Nations people to promote the very best of Indigenous economic development and business. The virtual environment and online platform has given us access to people in real time to talk about real issues with regards to the APEC economies and regions trade.
Where to from here? It's a matter of keeping this momentum going, the conversation going, but coming together with a bias for action so that we can execute on some of the best ideas that we have and share those amongst us as Indigenous peoples.
Creating further change together.
Thank you. There you go.
So thanks. Just in closing, I think 3 points from me about, where to from here. So New Zealand has really played a leadership role this year in advancing Indigenous economic inclusion. Vangelis talked about the Minister, Secretary Harland, who leaned in. We've got to keep doing that. We cannot take the focus off the opportunity that is ahead. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, at a very practical level, we've got to build on the foundations that we've laid. I was really astounded at the work of NZ and the agencies. We had over 11 different Indigenous dialogues and workshops. So we need to keep doing projects within APEC that show Indigenous voices count, get our people onto panels. We also have the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Collaboration Arrangement, which is soon to be announced, which essentially is a framework for greater economic and trade cooperation. I think that is an enduring mechanism that is really going to be very progressive in helping governments and Indigenous peoples work together in this trade and economic space. And then thirdly, when we start looking at Thailand's priorities for this year, I think we will start seeing Indigenous issues move sort of a little more into mainstream topics. And there, I talk about sustainability. Thailand is having a particular focus this year on things like the biocircular economy, on ESGs. And these are areas that are very integrated with an Indigenous perspective. So I think also we don't need to just be in our own separate swim lanes. We're going to be become a much more active voice within some of those topics like sustainability, which will clearly be an important part of APEC going forward. So thanks. We've come a long way, but a lot more to do. And you rangatahi, you young people that are on this call are the ones that are going to pick up the rākau and drive it forward. So kia kaha, and thanks, Fran, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now over to you, Rob, for your perspectives.
Thanks very much, Fran. And I'd like to begin by just having a massive shout out to the New Zealand APEC team, to Gillis, to Mark, to Taria, and all their colleagues, for the way they handled APEC this year. As a New Zealander observing the process from the sidelines, I just felt enormously proud of the way that New Zealand was actually representing itself through the way that the APEC process was managed. I mean, we've talked about the COVID response, we've talked about the Aotearoa action plan. Just to produce those outcomes in a normal year would have been a huge achievement, but to produce those by coordinating literally hundreds of meetings, all online, all operating across multiple time zones, and I'm sure many of the MFAT people were staying up at all hours of the night to do it. I think it was just a phenomenal achievement. And as I say, as a New Zealander, I'm very proud of it. So well done. Thanks very much to Jennifer for the opportunity to say a few words. I won't try not to duplicate what's already been said. I'll say a few things more about the importance of the Putrajaya vision and the Aotearoa plan of action, and also maybe about what APEC means to New Zealand. And I think it's perhaps well worth starting by taking the sort of APEC as it is and noting that APEC consists of 21 economies across the Asia-Pacific region. So we're talking about all of the East Asian and Australasian side of the Pacific on the west, the countries on the Pacific seaboard of the Americas on the east, and they come together to work together cooperatively. And APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation is a key word there. They come together to cooperate in the ways that Mark just so expertly described, to work together to underpin and ensure their common prosperity, and recognising that because of the very intense economic interaction between these economies, each economy's prosperity really depends on the region's prosperity, and they have a common motivation to come together to try to ensure that the region actually does promote the prosperity collectively and individually for each member economy. And I think that's a real strength of APEC, and I think Mark did very well to underline that. For New Zealand, of course, we can recognise that APEC, in very broad terms, accounts for approximately 3/4 of New Zealand's trade. If we and the East Asian part of APEC accounts for roughly half of that. If we add Australia to that, the western side of the Pacific accounts for nearly 2/3 of our trade. And so I think we do need to keep our eye on that. There's been a lot of talk, including at this conference, about the importance of developing new markets and so on, and that is important and it's very desirable, but we should not take our eye off the fact that it's the East Asian, well, it's the APEC region, and especially the East Asian part of that region is where our economic trade and interests are going to lie in the future, and that's not going to change anytime soon. You'll notice I talk about East Asia, not China. Yes, China is our main trading partner, but it is also an integral part, a key player in the closely integrated economic ecosystem that's been developed in East Asia. And it's really our relationship with East Asia as a whole that we really need to focus on a lot, maybe more than we're doing now even, to ensure our future economic and trade prosperity. I won't say anything about that COVID response. I think Mark and Vangelis covered that wonderfully, but I think it's important to say perhaps that if COVID had not occurred, just the task of producing the Aotea Action Plan would have been a huge challenge for any host economy. In New Zealand, that job actually fell to New Zealand because APEC had earlier earmarked 2019 and 2020 as the years for a reset after 32 years to look at what APEC was doing, to look at the vision that they were working to look at the work programs that they used to support that vision, and to develop perhaps a refreshed vision and a refreshed working plan coming out of that for the next 20 years. And that was originally supposed to be the main focus of New Zealand's APEC year. New Zealand, of course, engaged in that and achieved that, but they also dealt with that very, very effective COVID response. And so it was a double challenge, and it was doubly impressive to see how it was met. It's worth, I think, saying a little bit more about the Putrajaya vision, which was produced in the Malaysian year. Just worth highlighting that the vision describes an open, dynamic, resilient and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040 for the prosperity of all our peoples and future generations. It covers trade and investment, as we would expect, both regional trade and including some cherished ambitions, like what seems sometimes to be a faraway ambition of achieving the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, but also multilateral, focused on support for the WTO and trying to restore the primacy of the rules-based system, which is critically important for small countries like New Zealand, but also all those other issues, innovation and digitalisation, sustainability and inclusiveness, which have become more and more important and become more and more deeply embedded in the APEC program. Visions, of course, are empty words unless they're implemented. And so Malaysia produced the vision, or produced agreement on the vision, I should really say, and it was New Zealand's job to produce agreement on the action plan to give effect to that vision, and that is the Aotea Plan of Action. So what that actually does, it's important to recognise, I think, that it sets out the commitment of the APEC member economies to agreed individual and collective actions to implement that Putrajaya vision over the next 20 years. And quite importantly, it includes an agreed set of procedures for evaluating the progress of that implementation. So it's hugely important for APEC's future. I think APEC itself is hugely important for peace and prosperity in our region and the world, and also for New Zealand. So that action plan is actually a critical part of our future. And I think, again, MFAT and the APEC team need to be congratulated for their work in actually getting agreement on that, because we're all going to benefit from it in the future. I'm just skipping over a few things here. So I think we should also recognise that that outcome is an expression of the commitment and the determination of the APEC members to work together to put the Putrajaya vision into practice. Clearly, I think the APEC members have demonstrated through their agreement to that Aotearoa Plan of Action and the Putrajaya vision that they value Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, which is something which, as Mark has said, has been called into question more than perhaps in other earlier years in these last few years, but the members clearly value it. They want it to continue. And I think that's a message that really has to go out to the major powers in APEC. And we have to say, of course, that, and it's important to note that the United States, China, and Russia were part of that process. And while those countries coming together, those economies coming together in other contexts because of their well-known disagreements might be expected to be somewhat disruptive, to say the least. Obviously, they've either agreed with the Putrajaya vision and the implementation plan, or at the very least, they've agreed or decided not to oppose it. So it can be done, but I think APEC is probably one of the very few institutions where you could bring together those three superpowers and a whole range of middle and small powers to work together to produce a constructive and cooperative outcome. And that's really, again, one of the key features of APEC as I see it. It really, I think, has almost a unique capability in that respect. Taking that point about diversity a little further, I think it's worth noting in today's context that the APEC members have always manifested a plurality of political systems. And that's been perhaps underlined just very recently by the fact that 7 out of 21 APEC members were not invited to the Democracy Summit that was convened by the United States this week. China and 6 others actually were not invited from APEC, which I thought was a little bit stunning, to be honest, but it just demonstrates, I think, that we are a diverse region, but with all our political and diversity of political systems, the APEC members have always been able to come together in the past to cooperate, to build consensus, and to work out on ways in which all of the issues that we face can best be addressed. And I think that cooperative habit that has been developed in APEC over many years is certainly, I think, one of the factors, as well as the coordination of our MFAT team, that enabled APEC to develop the response both to COVID and also the new action plan in this year. So we're building on a long, long tradition that's been developed in APEC of working cooperatively and acknowledging that cooperation serves us all best. And I just have to hope that that continues. Just finally, a little bit of a discordant note, perhaps, to finish with, if I may. The baton is passed to Thailand, of course, for the hosting of APEC next year, and the United States has put its hand forward to host APEC in 2023. I'm not sure whether that's yet been agreed. And I know that MFAT were very pleased, and I think some said relieved, that the United States had offered to host APEC in 2023. I'd just like to say, as an outside observer, while I hope that's going to go well, I do have a little bit of nervousness about it, because I observed over the last 4 years, a very conscious effort in the United States to expunge the term Asia Pacific from virtually all documentation, discussion, policy dialogue, and so on, relating to our part of the world. And that's, you don't ever hear the Asia Pacific mentioned these days in Washington or in anybody who works there.
I think at this point, if you don't mind, Rob, we've only just got 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'll just finish by saying in a sentence that I do actually wonder how a country that has been so determined to airbrush Asia Pacific out of the lexicon,
which is actually,
how are they going to actually operate as the host of Asia Pacific economic cooperation in 2 years' time? And maybe somebody can comment on that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Vangeli, are you back on the panel? You had described yourself at one stage as being the anvil between 2 hammers through this whole process of APEC. But, obviously we didn't get that consensus at APEC about the US hosting. Can you update where that is, and also pick up on Rob's point about how we actually navigate going forward the Indo-Pacific construct, also with the Asia-Pacific construct, which APEC is.
So a couple of easy questions then.
Yeah.
So I mean, let me start with the first one. Yeah, no, indeed, we are still working with colleagues to ensure that that offer can be agreed, and I am confident that the United States will indeed host in 2023. And I think I hear what you're saying, Rob, but I do think it is still important that the United States is doing that, and the fact that it is doing so, I think, does tell you something about the seriousness with which it wants to lean into the region. And I think the interesting question is going to be, you know, what kind of agenda does it look to run, and how does that agenda complement what it is that's going on in the region already? Because you know, it is a region that is, how can we put it, very busy at the moment in the hard architecture. You know, number of accession applications, even from outside the region, from the British, from within the region, from China, Chinese Taipei, and of course others. Digital Economy Partnership Agreements got an accession request underway already with Korea, a request from China, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots going on. I think the interesting question is going to be, how does the United States respond, and how does it think about APEC as a vehicle for that response, and what kind of signaling does it send? I think it's a very powerful signal that it's already sent, and a very helpful one for all of us in the region, that, you know, that it is a major economy, and it is the United States that's going to host in 2023. On the intersection between Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific, look, I'm not too hung up on that. I mean, I do understand the concern. I mean, it's a nomenclature question, and I think it is one of those things where we're all grappling with. I think the really important question, though, is for how does APEC now take the work forward? And I think that is really, you know, APEC is not like the G20. So the G20, they don't have to get on. They're not even contiguous. They're not even major. The interesting thing about APEC is we all have to get on. We're all in the same region. We're all co-located in a geographic sense. We have to find a way. We have to find solutions that work. And that, I think, has been one of the big responsibilities we took on this year in a highly contested geopolitical environment. And we don't need, you know, yes, it's the anvil between two hammers. I can tell you that got pretty unpleasant at various moments. But look, in the end, we did find a way. And I am the eternal optimist about this. I am someone who really cares about APEC as part of our kind of, I keep using the phrase ecosystem. I do think it's really important that we not lose sight of how important this is. Frankly, I do not believe we could create APEC today, given the geopolitical environment we're in. This is a vital piece of the architecture, absolutely vital to our national interests.
Mark, just a quick point. I mean, earlier when you've talked about how APEC has been a strategic platform for a whole range of other initiatives that have been important to New Zealand diplomacy, including getting our ministers out in the world, making bilateral contacts. Can you just give us a brief insight into that?
Sure. I probably didn't describe this incredibly cogently, Fran, but one of my favourite facts that I use to illustrate this is that when you look at New Zealand's FTA architecture, we have FTAs that have entered into force with 18 of the other 20 APEC economies. Now, Vangelis will kind of grimace at this, but when you look outside of the APEC region, you will find that we have not one FTA that has entered into force that is centred on a non-APEC member. Why is that? You know, European Union, the United Kingdom, Mercosur, India, etc., etc. Why is that? I would suggest that that is because when you bring leaders together once a year, when you bring ministers together, trade ministers come together twice a year, and when you put them in a room together and you get them all talking about the same thing, that trade is good, that rules support small economies like us, as Rob has said, the natural thing when they're outside the room is to say, how about a deal? And that's why that happens in an APEC context, I would argue. It's not because, you know, the Asia Pacific region is naturally more inclined to do FTAs or anything like that. And that has been a massive driver of New Zealand's prosperity. As Rob said, 3/4 of our trade and investment flows are with Asia Pacific economies. And that's why it really matters to New Zealand. But there are innumerable other examples of some of those things that happen in the margins of APEC. But I've just talked about the FTA one, Fran.
Thank you very much. Look, I am under the watchful eyes of Jennifer Curtin, who has to wind up very shortly. But thank you so much for the panel. There's a lot of meat there. Would love to talk for another half hour, Jennifer, but floor over to you.
Kia ora, thanks, Fran, and I kia ora koutou, and to the panel, thank you. My apologies for being a hard taskmaster in this regard, but we really are on a tight schedule. So as you'll know, everyone who's on, I really hope you'll just stay on for another 3 or 4 minutes. We've come to the end of the formal proceedings for ATEPS 2021, and I know you want your lunch, but I just have to remind you of a few things before we leave and to share our collective thanks with a few people. So this was our third Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School and our first fully virtual conference. So while all the APEC people are really great at this, for us it was kind of new. So it would have been wonderful to have been together in the Whale on the campus at the University of Auckland, but online deliveries also enabled us to expand our suite of speakers and has made the participation of those outside Auckland and outside New Zealand to participate more easily. On the speakers side, I want to remind you that there are 4 bonus panels that are available to you on the platform that feature our international speakers that we pre-recorded over the past 3 weeks. Specifically, Professor Mike Plummer from Johns Hopkins, in conversation with our own Rob Scully, provides his insights on RCEPs. Associate Professor Shiro Armstrong and Professor Peter Drysdale from the Australian National University discuss the connections between the broader ASEAN and APEC economies and the geopolitics of the region. Professor Sarah Davies from Griffith University covers off the significant absence of good gender analysis in responding to the pandemic and the extent to which it reveals the need for intersectional gender lenses in planning and preparing for the post-COVID economic recovery in our region through trade and other mechanisms. And finally, you can hear more on the way climate change will continue to impact trade policy and trade practice from Professor Mark Howden, who is Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University. So do please take time over the coming month to watch those contributions and all the others that you may have missed over the past 2 days. Finally, it's important for me to give my thanks and appreciation to many people. So first, I want to acknowledge our speakers and chairs. There were more than 40 of you this year. You took time out from your busy schedules to share with us your knowledge and insights and offering various challenges to us to work, think, and do things differently to advance inclusive, sustainable trade in ways that connect with Mātauranga Māori and Indigenous perspectives from the Pacific. Second, I want to thank you, our audience, including our distinguished visitors and dignitaries, for joining us, for sharing your questions, and for staying with us online despite our initial technical hiccups yesterday. That we were able to continue online is in no small part thanks to Leigh, Tiffany and Grace from Event Services, whose agility yesterday was amazing. And Leigh, thank you for your work over these past months in getting us to this point. Third, my thanks go to MFAT for their continued support, to the team at the Auckland office in particular, but most of all to Colin Ballantyne, whose passion for this project has been really important to getting us to this point. I know that you and your MFAT colleagues have been exceptionally busy this year with APEC, with Delta, and with Afghanistan, as well as all those other secret squirrel events that we don't know about. And finally, to my team at the Public Policy Institute, to Mohammed and Adam for the administrative support, crafting the programs and the supporting documents, making travel bookings, cancelling travel bookings, and keeping us on track. And to Suzanne, who has been working with me on this event annually, and whose input, organisation and care has been constant and instrumental in ensuring the successful delivery you have all witnessed. If we were here in the Whale, I would be giving her a huge bunch of flowers right now, but now a virtual hug will have to suffice. With that, I wish you all well, a safe holiday season, and we look forward to welcoming you back next year for ATEPS 2022. For now, ngā mihi nui, kia ora rawa atu, haere rā.